The sea was calm the morning the Hospitallers first sighted Rhodes. From the decks of their weathered galleys, the island appeared like a promise, a citadel of sunlight and stone rising from the Aegean. Its hills dressed in cypress and olive, its harbors silent as if waiting for them alone. The year was 1309, and the Order of St. John had come not as conquerors, but as exiles seeking purpose. They had lost Jerusalem. They had lost Acre. They had lost their sanctuaries and their saints. Yet as the first anchors struck the shallows of Rhodes, something ancient stirred, not the sound of war, but of inheritance. For beneath the soil of that island, older empires had buried their secrets, Mycenaean tombs, Hellenistic altars, Roman baths and Byzantine chapels now given over to salt and wind. The Hospitallers saw more than ruins. They saw geometry, patterns of sacred order hidden in the chaos of centuries. It was said that Grand Master Fulk de Villeray, who led them ashore, carried with him not only papal sanction, but a sealed chest taken from Cyprus, containing scrolls transferred after the fall of the Templars. None but the highest brothers were permitted to open it. At night, when the island slept, flickers of lamplight could be seen from the fortress cellars where they worked in silence, drawing shapes upon parchment with compasses and ash. The local Greeks whispered that the new lords were not only knights, but mathematicians of God. The conquest of Rhodes was swift, yet strangely bloodless. The Byzantine garrison surrendered after months of siege, their commander allowed to depart with honor. To the chroniclers of the Order, it was divine providence. To the islanders, an unsettling miracle. For an army of wounded crusaders, reduced and scattered, had taken one of the most fortified isles of the Aegean as if guided by a design invisible to mortal eyes. Within a year, the Hospitallers transformed the island into a living fortress. Walls thickened, towers rose. Streets were redrawn according to celestial alignments, the points of the compass marking not only direction, but devotion. Each auberge, the residence of knights from a different long or nation, faced a different constellation. The chapel of St. John was built upon the ruins of an ancient temple to Helios, the sun god, as if light itself had been rebaptized. But beneath the faith and architecture, there was secrecy. Deep below the palace of the Grand Master, beneath the limestone foundations, the Order began hollowing chambers, not for prisoners or stores, but for preservation. A network of vaulted corridors wound downward into the bedrock, their walls lined with signs no mason claimed to have carved. Circles intersecting within squares, 8-pointed crosses joined by unseen symmetry. Some of the elder brothers called it the Domus Subterranea, the hidden house. It was there, whispered the novices, that the Grand Master's scribes translated the Templar codices, and within those codices lay maps, not of land, but of numbers. Ratios of sacred geometry said to trace the dimensions of Solomon's temple and perhaps even something older. By day, the island flourished. Merchants returned to its harbors, pilgrims sought healing in its infirmaries, and Rhodes became the shield of Christendom against the East. By night, the fortress hummed with quieter devotions. The sound of chisels beneath the earth, the rustle of parchment, the murmur of Latin mixed with Greek and Arabic. In those secret hours, The Hospitallers were not warriors, they were scholars, builders and keepers of a faith that moved in silence. Decades passed. The island grew rich with trade, and its citadel became the envy of the Aegean. Yet as centuries turned, so too did the balance of power. By the late 15th century, the East was no longer fractured. The Ottoman crescent had risen, its armies sweeping across Asia Minor and the Balkans. Constantinople had fallen. Mehmet the Conqueror, master of 2 continents, now set his gaze upon Rhodes, that last bastion of the Crusaders, defiant in its solitude. In the spring of 1480, the sea once again filled with sails. From the cliffs of Monte Smith, sentinels saw the horizon darken with Ottoman galleys. The air trembled with the hum of drums and banners of green and red, the emblems of empire approaching the white walls of St. John. Inside the fortress, Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson gathered his captains. The archives speak of courage and prayer, but one lesser-known account describes a different preparation, a command to seal the Domus Subterranea and open its deepest chamber. There, among torches and shadows, d'Aubusson examined what had been hidden for nearly 2 centuries. The Templar codices, the geometric diagrams, and the object at their center. A blackened chest bound with iron and engraved with the cross of Jerusalem. He ordered it to be carried beneath the Grand Palace into a newly cut vault. Officially, it was a refuge in case of siege. In truth, it was a vault of silence, lined with carvings that no mason claimed to have carved, circles intersecting within squares, 8-pointed crosses joined by unseen symmetry. As the first cannonballs struck the outer walls of Rhodes, the vault was sealed. And though the battle raged for months, the Ottomans never breached the heart of the fortress. When they finally withdrew, leaving thousands of their dead upon the shore, the Hospitallers gave thanks to God. But some among them whispered that it was not divine protection that saved them. It was the cipher, the hidden knowledge beneath their feet. From that year onward, the records of the order grew cautious. Pages were removed, names omitted. What began as a fortress had become a labyrinth of secrets. And in the quiet after the siege, when the last fires burned low, a few brothers descended once more into the vault and found the carvings changed. New lines had appeared upon the walls, forming shapes they had not made. Some said that the stone itself had learned to write. It was the beginning of the Rhodes Riddle, a code that would haunt the order for centuries, tracing its path through faith, empire, and shadow. A secret that even now may still sleep beneath the stones of Rhodes. The year was 1481, and the island of Rhodes stood scarred but unbroken. The fires had faded, and the scent of gunpowder and blood drifted slowly out to sea. Across the battered ramparts, the banners of St. John fluttered once more in the wind, faded, torn, but defiant. The city below them, half in ruin, began to breathe again. The people rebuilt their markets. The churches reopened. And within the walls of the Grand Palace, a different kind of restoration began, not of stone, but of secrecy. Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson, hailed by Europe as the savior of Christendom, withdrew from the public eye. Visitors to the palace saw only his seal on letters sent to the Pope and to Venice, thanking them for aid. Yet behind closed doors, he summoned a small council of 7 men, scribes, engineers, and physicians of the order, and charged them with a task that no chronicle would ever record. Their meeting place was deep below the palace, in a vaulted chamber whose air smelled of salt and wax. The torches burned low, their light flickering across symbols carved into the stone, not Latin inscriptions, but patterns of intersecting circles and triangles that resembled astronomical charts. Some believed they marked the constellations over Rhodes on the night of its salvation. Others whispered they were maps of another kind. Among the 7 was a brother named Matteo de Villanove, a quiet man trained in the art of healing and geometry. He was said to possess an uncommon gift, an ability to see numerical harmony in natural things, the curve of a shell, the veins of a leaf, the spacing of stars. To him, God's language was proportion. It was Matteo who first noticed that the markings on the vault's walls mirrored those found on the Templar manuscripts. The same ratios appeared again and again, 3:5, 8:13, the sacred sequence of Fibonacci, known to the scholars of the East long before it reached Europe. The knights believed it no coincidence. They began to suspect that their fortress itself was built according to this divine pattern, a geometry linking heaven and earth. Weeks turned into months as the island healed. Yet while masons repaired the towers and monks tended to the wounded, the hidden work continued below. The 7 brothers copied the symbols, measured their distances, and discovered that the alignments beneath the grand palace extended outward, along the Street of the Knights, beneath the auberge, toward the harbor itself. When traced upon parchment, the lines formed the image of a cross surrounded by a circle, the ancient sigil of perfection. What it meant, none could say. But Matteo believed it was a map, not to gold, but to knowledge, a relic of a wisdom older than either cross or crescent. D'Aubuchon ordered that their findings be written in cipher, a language of numbers and letters intertwined, readable only through a complex ratio known as ratio aurea sancta, the sacred golden measure. Each brother swore an oath to protect the secret until death, and to pass it only to one successor chosen in silence. Thus began the hidden lineage of the Custodes Cifra, the keepers of the cipher, a circle within the order that would endure long after Rhodes itself was lost. Above ground, life seemed to return to ordinary rhythm. Pilgrims came from afar to see the fortress that had resisted the Ottomans. Artists and architects praised its symmetry. The bells of the Cathedral of St. John rang again across the harbor, but the sound carried an undertone, the steady rhythm of chisels from below as workmen reshaped the catacombs, carving new corridors and bricking others shut. By 1485, rumors began to spread among the townspeople. Some spoke of tunnels reaching all the way to the sea. Others claimed that the knights were hiding the Sultan's captured treasure in the catacombs. The Hospitallers ignored the whispers, yet the merchants who supplied them with stone and lime noticed strange requests, slabs cut to exact proportions, marked not with saints or crosses, but with numbers. Always 8 numbers in sequence, always arranged in the form of a star. Matteo de Villanove grew old before the mystery was solved. In his final days, he is said to have inscribed a single phrase upon the wall of his cell in Latin: Lux sub lapide dormit. The light sleeps beneath the stone. After his death, his apprentice, Brother Niccolo, continued the work, tracing the hidden alignments through the old city. Beneath the Auberge of France, he found a sealed archway that led to a circular chamber long forgotten. On its ceiling were carved symbols of both Christian and Islamic origin, stars, crescents, and the 8-pointed cross intertwined. At the chamber's center lay a slab of black basalt, smooth as glass, inscribed with lines too faint to read by torchlight. When the stone was polished, however, the lines gleamed faintly gold. It was the same golden hue, Niccolo noted, that shimmered from the treasure seized from the Ottoman ships years before. Yet d'Aubusson forbade further excavation. The chamber was sealed again, its existence struck from the records. The Grand Master, once hailed as hero, grew withdrawn, his letters to Rome increasingly cryptic. Some of his final writings spoke not of war or faith, but of a covenant made beneath the earth, a phrase the Vatican scribes could not decipher. In time, Pierre d'Aubusson died. His tomb was built in the chapel of the palace, directly above the chamber he had sealed. The epitaph upon his sarcophagus read simply, Fidei defensor arcane custodes, defender of the faith, keeper of secrets. The island passed through years of uneasy peace. The Ottoman threat waned, then returned, like a shadow that never quite vanished. But the deeper secret, the pattern of numbers, the golden lines, the sleeping light, remained untouched, waiting for another generation to awaken it. Centuries later, when the Hospitallers fled Rhodes to Malta, they carried with them fragments of this hidden knowledge, fragments that would resurface long after the Order's glory had faded, as the enigma historians would one day call the Rhodes Riddle.
Centuries are not measured on Rhodes by calendars alone. They are counted in the erosion of stone, in the deepening of the grooves along the marble steps, in the salt that gathers year after year on the fortress walls. The island breathes slowly, and the Hospitallers learn to move with its rhythm. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Order of St. John had rebuilt Rhodes into a fortress of harmony. The streets of the upper town followed an unseen grid, their intersections echoing the geometry of the vault below. Every tower aligned with a constellation, every chapel window framed the rising of a particular star. Scholars who visited from Florence and Venice described the city as a diagram of faith drawn upon the earth. The knights, ever disciplined, said little. They continued their rituals, their charity, their defense, yet within their workshops, hidden behind the facades of monasteries and hospitals, the art of the cipher continued. The 7 symbols of the Custodes Cifra, the keepers of the cipher, were etched discreetly into their tools: a cross, a circle, a serpent, a star, a key, a number, and a flame. Each stood for an aspect of the knowledge they guarded. Beneath the Grand Palace, the old subterranean vault was extended. A new generation of masons, unaware of its true purpose, carved corridors that spiraled downward with mathematical precision. The walls were measured to ratios that matched the ancient Pythagorean harmonies, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 8. When a pilgrim walked those tunnels carrying a candle, the echo of each footstep fell exactly upon the pause between heartbeats, as if the stone itself was composed to a hidden rhythm. Brother Niccolo, the apprentice of Matteo de Villignon, became Grand Archivist of the Order. Under his direction, the Hospitallers began copying their secret manuscripts using a new technique imported from Venice: black ink infused with trace amounts of powdered gold. In lamplight it appeared ordinary, but under moonlight the ink glowed faintly, as though illuminated from within. Only those who knew the cipher could read the true text. Others merely saw devotional hymns and medicinal formulas. Outside the fortress, Rhodes prospered. Merchants brought spices from Alexandria, silks from Anatolia, and manuscripts from the libraries of Constantinople. In the markets, one could hear Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Turkish mingling like the tides. The Hospitallers' physicians studied alongside Greek healers and Jewish scholars, exchanging knowledge that would later shape the medicine of Europe. But prosperity carries silence within it, a silence that can hide unease. Among the people of Rhodes, strange symbols began to appear in the most unlikely places, carved into door lintels, painted upon the sides of amphora, or woven into the hems of tapestries. Circles crossed by stars, or series of 8 dots forming the points of a Maltese cross. The islanders, practical folk, took them for blessings or charms against disease. Yet to the initiated, they were messages, parts of a greater pattern unfolding across the city like a map written by time itself. In 1520, a visiting cartographer from Genoa named Girolamo de Verrazzano noted something peculiar while sketching the island's coast. When he plotted the major churches, towers, and gates of Rhodes upon his parchment, the points formed a perfect octagon, each vertex aligning precisely with one of the order's 8 sacred virtues. Intrigued, he mentioned it in his journal. The city seems built not by men, but by compass and devotion alike. That same year, rumors spread that the Ottomans were preparing once more to strike. Suleiman, the new sultan, was gathering fleets across the Aegean. The sea that had once brought pilgrims now carried the sound of distant drums. Within the grand palace, the older knights gathered in solemn council. They had defended the island before, and they would do so again. Yet the tone of their prayers changed. No longer were they pleas for victory, but for preservation, not of their lives, but of the mystery they had sworn to keep. Brother Niccolo, now frail and near his end, summoned his last pupil, a young knight of Provence named Guillaume de Blainville. To him Niccolo entrusted a small cube of obsidian, engraved with patterns of dots so minute they seemed invisible except under moonlight. He spoke little as he passed it on, but the few words he uttered would echo through centuries. Guard this not as treasure, but as key. The island speaks through its stones. The cube would later become known as the Hospitaller Grid, the heart of the Rhodes Riddle. In 1522, the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon like a black storm. Suleiman, the Magnificent, whose armies had already taken Belgrade, now demanded the surrender of Rhodes. The knights refused. The siege that followed was long and merciless. Cannons thundered day and night. Towers collapsed, the harbor filled with wrecks and ash. Yet even as their walls crumbled, the Hospitallers continued their silent task below, preserving their archives, sealing chambers, and leaving behind symbols carved so deep that centuries of erosion could not erase them. When at last the city fell, Suleiman, impressed by the courage of the defenders, granted them safe passage to leave. The surviving brothers boarded their ships and sailed away, carrying little but their banners, relics, and the black cube that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Behind them, Rhodes fell silent, its streets emptied, its vaults sealed, its secret geometry buried beneath layers of time and conquest. But the pattern remained. The lines carved into the island's stone still traced an unseen design, the echo of a knowledge that refused to die. And far out at sea, as the Hospitaller ships drifted toward Malta, Guillaume de Blainville stood upon the deck, turning the obsidian cube in his palm. In its dark surface, he saw faint golden reflections, the shape of the Dodecanese islands glowing like constellations in the night. One island, however, was missing. The Isle of Silence had not yet spoken. The winter sea between Rhodes and Crete was gray and vast, its surface broken only by the slow procession of ships bearing the last knights of St. John. Their red sails hung heavy with salt and wind. The banner of the White Cross, tattered by cannon fire, still rose above the flagship's mast, not as a sign of victory, but of endurance. Behind them, Rhodes receded into mist. The island that had been their home for more than 2 centuries vanished into the horizon like a fading memory. Those who stood upon the decks said little. They had buried too many brothers to speak of triumph, and yet in their silence there was a strange calm, the calm of men who knew that faith endures where kingdoms do not. Among their cargo lay relics of their long tenure on the island, icons, manuscripts, fragments of marble, and sealed chests of records. But deep within the Grand Master's quarters rested something rarer, the obsidian cube that had once gleamed beneath the moon of Rhodes. Guillaume de Blainville, still young yet marked by siege and loss, was its keeper now. The older knights said little of the cube, except that it was to be protected above all else. Some believed it contained the coordinates to hidden treasure. Others thought it was merely a relic of superstition. Yet when Guillaume gazed upon it under starlight, faint golden lines still appeared, branching like rivers across its surface. And again, one island in the pattern was missing. Their voyage took them first to Crete, then to Messina, and finally to the court of Emperor Charles V, who would grant them refuge on Malta. But before the Hospitallers left the Aegean behind, their fleet anchored briefly among the smaller islands of the Dodecanese for water, for wind, and for remembrance. One of those islands was Alemia, a barren rock, forgotten by maps where no harbor offered safety. Fishermen called it cursed. The logbooks of the order recorded it only as a waypoint, Isla del Silencio. Yet as the Hospitallers approached, their compasses faltered, their lamps dimmed, and the air filled with a strange stillness. Guillaume later wrote in his private journal that he heard, faintly, the tolling of bells across the sea, though no church stood there and no wind carried the sound. When dawn came, they saw nothing but stone and scrub, and so they departed. But in Guillaume's notes, preserved centuries later in the archives of Valletta, a single line was added in a trembling hand. The island speaks not in sound, but in pattern. The Hospitallers reached Malta in 1530. Their new island was harsher, drier, less forgiving than Rhodes, but it offered safety, and in its cliffs they began once more to carve their vision of faith. Valletta would rise as their new citadel, and the fortress would echo the geometry of Rhodes, the same angular bastions, the same measured streets, the same proportions of stone and silence. Yet those who knew the old island whispered that Malta's foundations were not entirely new. They followed the same cipher, the same 8-pointed pattern that had once been carved beneath the Grand Palace. Within a few years, the Hospitallers' archives were reassembled. The surviving cipher manuscripts from Rhodes were catalogued and sealed under the authority of the Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam. Among them was a codex labeled Liber Aureus Rhodiensis, the Golden Book of Rhodes, containing charts, ratios, and star alignments no one dared to decipher. A note in the margin, written in Latin, read, "To open this book is to awaken the island." In the decades that followed, the order grew strong again. They built hospitals, fortresses, and fleets that would one day defeat the Ottomans at sea. But their secret heritage, the silent science of proportion and cipher, survived in whispers. A few among the brothers were chosen to guard the legacy of Rhodes, tracing the same golden lines upon Maltese stone. They called themselves simply Custodes Luminis, the keepers of the light. Meanwhile, back on Rhodes, life went on under Ottoman rule. The mosques rose beside the old chapels. The call to prayer mingled with the tolling of ancient bells. Yet beneath the new empire's foundations, the tunnels of the Hospitallers remained untouched. The local masons who stumbled upon them spoke of passages leading to chambers where the air was cold and dry, where walls shimmered faintly in darkness as if painted with stars. Ottoman officials sealed them, calling the place haram, forbidden. In 1595, an Ottoman tax collector recorded a curious finding. A stone panel recovered from the ruins near the old palace of the Grand Master. It bore inscriptions not in Latin, not in Arabic, but in a language of numbers and symbols unknown. The record noted that the panel was shipped to Constantinople, and there it vanished. Centuries later, travelers who visited Rhodes at night still spoke of strange patterns glowing faintly upon the stones of the Street of the Knights, circles and crosses that appeared only in moonlight and faded at dawn. Some said it was the salt of the sea crystallizing upon the walls. Others whispered it was the memory of the Hospitallers themselves, etched forever into the island's geometry. And so Rhodes slept, its riddles buried beneath Ottoman minarets and Venetian legends, its cipher forgotten by time. Yet the pattern, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen, continued beneath the surface. It waited, silent and patient, for the age when men would once again learn to listen to the language of light and stone. Far away in Malta, Guillaume de Blonville, now an old man, stood on the ramparts of Fort St. Angelo and gazed eastward. The stars above the Mediterranean mirrored the grid he had once seen within the cube. He knew then that the riddle of Rhodes had not ended with exile. It had merely changed its voice. The pattern was no longer confined to a single island. It had become a map across empires, a code binding Rhodes, Malta, and something in between. The Isle of Silence still waited in its place between them, unseen on charts, unspoken in chronicles, yet always there, like a missing note in a hymn. And somewhere beneath its barren stone, the secret of both cross and crescent slept, waiting for its light to be found again.
By the middle of the 17th century, the Knights Hospitaller had become more than warriors. They were patrons of art, architects, and astronomers, stewards of a realm that stood at the crossroad between empires. The island of Malta, once a barren rock, now gleamed with the limestone grandeur of cathedrals and bastions, its capital, Valletta, rising in luminous symmetry above the sea. Visitors who entered the city through the gate of St. James often remarked upon its order, the precision with which each street met the next, the balance of light and shadow, the measured silence of its courtyards. Yet few realized that this design was not merely practical, but philosophical. Hidden within the architecture of Valletta was a memory, the unseen geometry of Rhodes reborn in new stone. Among the architects of this vision was Fra Girolamo de Montfaucon, a knight of the Longueuil of Auvergne and an accomplished astronomer. He had been trained not only in fortifications, but in the mathematics of harmony, the belief that all creation moved according to divine proportion. Under his supervision, the new auberges of the order were built according to ratios that matched the measurements found in ancient Greek temples. Each column, each arch, each window was an echo of an older code. And when the sun fell at certain angles, the shadows formed patterns, crosses, circles, and stars that aligned precisely with the constellations above.
Montfaucon recorded these alignments meticulously in his notebooks, noting that the system mirrored the layout of the old city of Rhodes. In the margin of one page, he added a single Latin phrase: Architectura est memoria. Architecture is memory. It was during this period that scholars within the order began to revisit their archives. The Liber Aureus Rhodiensis, long locked away in the vault of Fort St. Angelo, was unsealed for the first time in over a century. The gold-flecked ink had darkened with age, but the geometry remained precise, lines intersecting at intervals that corresponded not to land, but to stars. Montfaucon recognized something extraordinary. When the diagrams were overlaid with the night sky above the Dodecanese, the points of the pattern aligned not only with Rhodes, but with a ring of surrounding islands, Halki, Simi, Telos, and Alimia. Each formed part of a celestial equation. But the final coordinate, the one that should have completed the circle, was missing. The absence intrigued him. He began to suspect that the lost island, the Isle of Silence, was not a myth, but a fixed point in a mathematical design deliberately erased to conceal its purpose. The Grand Master, Adrien de Widnacourt, encouraged Montfaucon's research, believing it might reveal ancient knowledge useful for navigation or fortification. Under papal blessing, a small observatory was constructed atop the bastion of St. Michael. There, the night astronomers of the order charted the stars of the Eastern Sea, comparing them with the patterns found in their manuscripts. What they discovered would puzzle them for years. Certain alignments between the stars and the positions of the islands shifted in ways that defied normal celestial drift. The constellations of Orion and Cygnus, when traced along the lines of the Liber Aureus, revealed mirrored triangles pointing directly toward the southeast, toward the unseen point where the Isle of Silence would have been. Montfaucon wrote in his diary, "The heavens remember what the earth conceals." In the archives of Valletta, among the order's maps, he found something older, a thin copper plate engraved with circles and inscriptions in both Latin and Arabic numerals. The plate was marked with the double cross of Jerusalem, yet along its edge ran a delicate engraving of the crescent moon, the same symbol reported on relics of the Rhodes vault. The fusion of cross and crescent puzzled him. To most it was heresy. To Montfaucon it was reconciliation, a sign that faith and knowledge, east and west, once met in secret understanding. He sent his findings to Rome. The reply came months later, terse and cautious. Study may continue, but silence must prevail. Despite the warning, Montfaucon pressed on. He began a new codex, Tractatus de Luminis Sigillo, Treatise on the Seal of Light, wherein he attempted to reconcile theology with geometry. He proposed that the eight-pointed cross of the Hospitallers was not merely symbolic of the Beatitudes, but a mathematical key, a pattern of infinite proportion, capable of unlocking harmony between all systems of belief. His peers regarded this with polite curiosity, then quiet alarm. Such ideas bordered on mysticism, dangerous in an age of strict doctrine. By 1670, the Holy Office in Rome ordered the codex confiscated. Montfaucon was not accused of heresy, but he was instructed to cease all astronomical experiments that might conflate divine and natural order. The observatory of St. Michael was shuttered, and the Liber Aureus returned to its vault. Montfaucon withdrew into the priory gardens, tending vines and writing in secret. His later papers, discovered long after his death, speak of a dream he had during his final nights. He described walking once more through the streets of Rhodes, the stones glowing faintly with golden lines, leading him toward the sea. There, upon the water, rose an island shrouded in mist, its surface marked by a single tower of black stone. He awoke with the words, "Lux utor oritur sub silencio." The light rises again beneath the silence. That phrase would be carved on his tomb in Valletta, where it remains to this day, a quiet monument to a secret never spoken aloud. And thus the Rhodes Riddle passed once more into slumber. The Hospitallers, now admired across Europe for their charity and valor, guarded their mystery beneath the weight of centuries. But symbols carved into walls do not fade. Numbers once inscribed remember. In the stillness of night, when the Maltese wind whispered through the bastions, some said they could hear a faint echo, not of cannon, nor of bells, but of stone speaking to stone across the sea. The dialogue of islands, unbroken since the fall of Rhodes. It was the summer of 1943 when the silence of the Aegean broke again. Long after the Hospitallers had vanished, after their strongholds had become museums and ruins, Rhodes once more became the stage for an empire's secret war. The Germans called it Unternehmen Sonnenkreuz, Operation Suncross, a classified archaeological and intelligence mission sanctioned by the Ahnenerbe, the mystical research institute of the SS. Officially, their purpose was scientific, to study medieval fortifications and collect Byzantine artifacts before Allied forces could reach them. Unofficially, their orders were far stranger. Berlin had received reports from Italian officers, from Greek fishermen, from fragments of Vatican correspondence, that beneath the stones of Rhodes and its neighboring islets lay a hidden structure, hospitaller in design and heretical in origin. The Führer's scholars believed it might conceal a relic of immense symbolic power, a cipher of light, perhaps connected to the lost knowledge of the Templars. The expedition was led by Dr. Heinrich Voss, a historian of ancient geometry and a member of the SS's occult division. He had studied in Heidelberg under the archaeologist Otto Rahn, the same Rahn who once hunted for the Holy Grail in the Pyrenees. Voss carried with him a black leather-bound notebook marked with a double sigil, the Maltese cross over a crescent moon. He claimed the symbol came from a medieval cube once kept in the Vatican treasury, the Hospitaller grid. Their first base was established within the ruins of the Palace of the Grand Masters. By day, the Germans conducted formal excavations, sketching arches, cataloging frescoes. By night, they descended into the lower chambers, where radar instruments and magnetic compasses traced anomalies beneath the stone. The local Greek workers spoke little, but watched carefully. They said that in those tunnels, the air changed, the temperature dropped, and the walls seemed to hum faintly, like a living thing remembering its past. On August 14, 1943, the instruments registered a hollow space 30 meters below the Street of the Knights, a vault of perfect symmetry. The reports described polygonal alignment consistent with sacred geometry and engraved numerals corresponding to the Pythagorean tetractys. Inside, the explorers found fragments of fused volcanic stone, impossible to penetrate even with modern drills. The sealed wall bore the inscription in Latin and Greek, Sub silencio lux dormiens. Under silence, the light sleeps. Weeks later, a second discovery was made on the nearby island of Elimia, the same barren rock once called the Isle of Silence. Under cover of darkness,
Voss and his small team arrived aboard a German patrol boat. They followed coordinates derived from the Liber Aureus Rhodiensis, a copy reportedly stolen from the Vatican's archives years earlier. At dawn, they reached the ruins of a Byzantine chapel overlooking a small bay. Beneath its altar, hidden behind a layer of volcanic stone, they found a staircase spiraling downward into blackness. The steps led to a vaulted chamber of unmistakable hospitaller design. Carved into the walls were geometric mosaics, circles intersecting crosses, stars merging with crescents, all glowing faintly with mineral light when their lanterns passed. In the center of the room stood a small pedestal supporting a rectangular slab, half buried in ash and sea salt. Voss ordered the slab uncovered. Beneath it, they found a cache of gold bars, each stamped with a sigil never before recorded, a cross entwined with a crescent, encircled by an 8-pointed star, the same mark described centuries earlier in the forbidden writings of Otto Rahn. For several nights, the German camp on Illimia burned with lanterns and excitement. But on the fourth night, a storm rose from the east, violent and sudden. Radio contact with Rhodes was lost. By morning, the bay was silent again. The patrol boat was found half sunken, with its equipment scattered. The excavation site had collapsed, sealed again beneath tons of rock. No trace of the gold, nor of Voss's team, was ever recovered. Only a single notebook resurfaced months later, confiscated by Allied intelligence after the war. Its final entry, written in trembling script, read, "The design is complete. The cube reveals its face. The missing island is not lost. It moves with the stars." British intelligence archived the notebook under file X92/Aegean, later marked Classified, Hermetic Studies Division. In the margin, a British officer noted, "Voss appears to describe a navigational pattern linking the Dodecanese islands with magnetic anomalies along the seafloor. Possible link to medieval hospitaller lore. Recommend no further investigation. Potential cultural contamination." The file was buried. The war ended. Rhodes became quiet once more. But the legend did not die. In the 1970s, divers exploring Illimia reported hearing metallic echoes beneath the seabed, rhythmic like distant bells. And in 1991, an Italian historian visiting the old Grand Master's palace found a single gold coin embedded in a collapsed wall, marked with the same cross and crescent sigil that Voss described. He sent it to the Vatican for authentication. The coin was never seen again. And so even in the modern age of satellites and science, the Rhodes Riddle continued to hum beneath the world's noise, a geometry of faith and silence, gold and light, drawn between the ruins of men and the constellations of heaven. The voice of the island remained, whispering its ancient refrain. Under silence, the light sleeps.
At dawn, the streets of Rhodes awaken not with battle cries, but with the soft murmur of tourism, footsteps on cobblestones, the rustle of olive trees in the harbor wind. Yet beneath this postcard serenity, the island holds another heartbeat, one too slow, too deep to be heard by the living. For decades, the legend of the Hospitaller Vault was dismissed as a medieval invention. Then, in 2016, a team from the University of Athens began a new survey beneath the Palace of the Grand Masters, using ground-penetrating radar to map its substructure. The project was purely academic, an effort to trace Byzantine foundations beneath the medieval layers. But within weeks, the radar returned an anomaly. A perfect void, 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and entirely sealed, running parallel to the Street of the Knights. It was too precise to be natural, too symmetrical to be coincidence. Dr. Eleni Papadakis, the project's director, stood in the chamber above the anomaly one evening as the last sunlight faded across the Aegean. She had read of the Hospitallers in dusty Latin manuscripts, but this geometry buried in stone, stirred something older, something almost devotional. The instruments showed 8 linear corridors converging at a single point, forming a pattern unmistakably similar to the 8-pointed cross of the Order. She whispered to herself, "Octava lux, the 8th light." When excavations began, the workers uncovered fragments of basalt carved with repeating symbols, circles intersecting stars, dots arranged in squares. Under ultraviolet light, the markings glowed faintly gold. The pattern matched sketches from a confiscated SS notebook, the one attributed to Dr. Heinrich Voss, found after the war. The Greek Ministry of Culture soon intervened, halting the dig and sealing the site. But copies of the scans had already circulated among the research team. One evening, as Eleni reviewed the data in her Rhodes apartment, she noticed a faint extension of the tunnels toward the western sea wall, an area once connected to an underground aqueduct leading to the harbor. When she adjusted the rendering contrast, a secondary formation appeared. Not man-made, but patterned, like a code drawn in the bedrock itself. The formation matched in eerie precision the constellation Delphinus, the dolphin, the same constellation that, in medieval hospitaller charts, symbolized safe passage between islands, and was often paired with a Latin motto, Sub aquis veritas dormiens. Beneath the waters, truth sleeps. Eleni sent her findings to the university archives, expecting silence. Instead, she received a message from an unnamed Vatican contact, brief, polite, and unnervingly direct. Do not continue your study. Some patterns are not meant to be completed. 2 weeks later, the entire project was quietly defunded. Equipment was removed. The vault entrance was resealed beneath fresh layers of stone. But Eleni did not stop. In the following months, she traveled to nearby islands, Chalki, Simi, Alimia, tracing old port records, inscriptions, and ship manifests. On Alimia, she found fragments of volcanic glass scattered near the ruins of the Byzantine chapel, black obsidian, polished smooth by time. When exposed to moonlight, the glass reflected faint golden lines, forming the same missing pattern from the ancient Hospitaller cube, the missing island in the chain of the Dodecanese. For a moment, standing alone beneath the Aegean stars, she realized the cube's message was never static. It was dynamic, astronomical. The missing island was not a place, but a moment in celestial alignment, a bridge of light between Rhodes and the western horizon, visible only when the constellation Delphinus passed directly over the Aegean's reflective plane. A code written not in parchment or stone, but in time itself. That night, as the sea wind howled through the ruins, she recorded a single line in her notebook. The riddle was never about gold. It is the geometry of silence, a language that moves with the stars. When she returned to Rhodes, her apartment had been emptied. Books, files, drives, all gone. Only a single object remained on her desk, a small, square stone of obsidian, cool to the touch, etched with 8 faint dots. Some say she disappeared soon after, leaving behind no forwarding address, no papers,
No explanation. Others claim she joined a private foundation based in Valletta, one that studies the sacred mathematics of the Crusader orders. What is certain is that her last transmission, archived anonymously online months later, contained a single radar image of the underground vault. When analyzed, the image revealed not random architecture, but a perfect fractal, a recursive Maltese cross repeating into infinity, as though the geometry itself were alive. And there, at its unseen center, glowed a faint signature in the electromagnetic field, a pulse repeating every 8 seconds, perfectly timed with the rising and setting of the Delphinus constellation. The heartbeat of the island, the last echo of a secret the Hospitallers once vowed to guard. The Rhodes Riddle, still whispering in the dark, between faith and science, between the stones and the sea.
The sea that once guarded Rhodes now guards Malta, a mirror of history reflecting sunlight over limestone walls. For centuries, the island has been called the Fortress of Faith, a name earned not through prayer alone, but through the measured patience of survival. When the Hospitallers fled Rhodes in 1522, they brought with them relics, records, and the last 7 cipher keepers. Here, on this rock of honey-colored stone, they began again, building cathedrals, hospitals, and fortresses that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the sea. But among the many archives and sanctuaries they raised, one remained sealed longer than any other, the Crypta Geometrica beneath Valletta's co-cathedral of St. John. In the modern era, few knew of its existence. Official guides mentioned only the visible crypts, lined with marble tombs of grand masters and saints. Yet hidden behind a false wall, accessible only through a narrow passage known to a handful of clerics, lay a chamber without ornament, only geometry. No crosses, no paintings, no saints' bones. Just patterns, circles within squares, stars aligned with golden threads embedded into the floor. An altar stood at its center, its base carved with the same 8-pointed cross found across the Mediterranean, but with one difference. At the heart of the cross, instead of a void, was a carved crescent. It was here, according to restricted Vatican inventories, that fragments of the Alymian cube were kept, black stones traced with gold veins, each one bearing fragments of cipher markings. The records were dated to 1569, the year of the Great Siege, when the Ottoman fleet thundered against Malta's walls. In that same year, Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette ordered the creation of the Archivum Secreto Rhodense, a private archive dedicated not to warfare, but to the preservation of the knowledge of our order before the flood of silence. Centuries later, in 2022, a small group of historians obtained permission to study the archive under the auspices of the Order of St. John's Sovereign Military Council. Among them was a quiet woman known only by her initials, E.P. In the Vatican's files, her name was redacted, but her notes were unmistakable. The handwriting matched that of Dr. Eleni Papadakis. Her arrival in Malta was discreet. She rented a small room overlooking the Grand Harbor, spending her days walking the narrow streets of Valletta, tracing the same paths the Hospitallers once patrolled. Each evening she descended into the crypt under St. John's, guided by the Order's archivist, Brother Matthias, an elderly monk who spoke with the calm patience of one who had spent decades in silence.
He told her that some of the Hospitaller records could not be translated by any modern scholar. Their text, though Latin in appearance, followed an internal symmetry that defied linguistic logic. Every eighth word mirrored the previous 7, an algorithm centuries ahead of its time. The structure itself resembled a cipher grid, 8 by 8, infinite in recursion, encoding geometry through scripture. One night, as rain whispered over the streets above, Eleni noticed a small imperfection in the altar's base, a removable stone plate shaped like a cube. When she lifted it, she found beneath it a cavity containing a sealed glass vial. Inside the vial was a fragment of obsidian, smooth and dark as midnight, etched with the same dots she had seen on Rhodes. Under the soft yellow light of the crypt, she placed the fragment beside a relic kept in the archives, a shard believed to be part of the Hospitaller grid. When aligned, the golden veins of the 2 stones completed a design, not a map of islands, but of stars, forming the constellation Delphinus, now perfectly connected. Brother Matthias watched silently as the lines shimmered faintly, reacting to the candlelight. He whispered a line from an old Hospitaller psalm. "When heaven mirrors earth, the path shall awaken." At that moment, the temperature in the crypt seemed to drop. The candle flames bent toward the stones. A low hum resonated through the floor, not from the air, but from the walls themselves, as though something vast and patient had just stirred after centuries of sleep. Eleni recorded the event in her notebook with precision. She described the frequency as rhythmic, pulsing once every 8 seconds. She noted that the vibration corresponded exactly to the same pulse measured beneath Rhodes. 2 islands, 2 vaults, 1 heartbeat. The next morning, the church authorities ordered the crypt sealed again for restoration. Eleni was asked to leave Malta for security reassessment. Brother Matthias, she later learned, was reassigned to a monastery in Gozo and never seen again. Weeks later, however, an anonymous package arrived at the University of Athens. Inside was a microfilm reel labeled RR, Valletta, 2022. Its contents were minimal, a single image of the crypt's floor, illuminated by candlelight, showing an intricate geometric design glowing faintly in the darkness. At its center, engraved in Latin, were the words Unitas per silentium, unity through silence. The film was archived and forgotten by all but a few scholars. Yet those who have viewed it describe feeling an inexplicable calm, a sense that the pattern, though silent, was alive, humming with the same gentle rhythm as the tides that lap against Malta's stone shores. In that silence, the Hospitallers' legacy endures, not in their fortresses or their swords, but in their devotion to an unseen order, a geometry linking heaven, earth, and human understanding.
In the hush of midnight libraries, where dust drifts like forgotten prayer, history reveals its subtler truths. The Knights Hospitaller, known to the world as warriors and healers, were also students, inheritors of a tradition older than Christendom itself. Their signs of cipher did not begin in the cathedrals of Europe, but in the marble schools of ancient Greece, where philosophers once whispered that the world was born from number. It was said that the Hospitallers' most secret creed, order through geometry, derived from a lineage that stretched back to Pythagoras of Samos, the island philosopher who taught that harmony was the measure of all existence. To the uninitiated, the eight-pointed cross was a symbol of faith. To the Hospitaller mathematicians, it was an equation, a compass of balance, dividing the heavens into perfect symmetry. Through the Byzantine centuries, this geometry endured in monasteries that blended Greek science with Christian mysticism. Within the mosaics of Constantinople and the scriptoria of Mount Athos, sacred numbers were hidden inside icons, halos drawn in perfect ratios, stars arranged by the rule of the tetractys. When the Hospitallers arrived in the East, they inherited this fusion of art and number, faith and proportion. And when they built their fortresses on Rhodes and later Malta, they embedded that wisdom in stone. Architectural historians have long noted that the Palace of the Grand Masters in Rhodes was not merely defensive. Its design followed Euclidean harmonics. The main corridors form a sequence that mirrors the Fibonacci progression. Each arch, when measured, aligns not by chance, but by ratio, a silent hymn to the golden mean. This was the Hospitaller cipher, not ink on parchment, but mathematics transcribed into architecture. To them, geometry was not decoration, it was devotion. They believed that through perfect proportion one could glimpse the divine, for in number God had left his handwriting. Every angle, every measure, every symmetrical corridor was a form of prayer. Later, as Eleni Papadakis traced the pulse between Rhodes and Malta, she realized the rhythm of 8 seconds was not arbitrary. It reflected a numerical constant, 1/8 of a lunar cycle's vibrational harmonic, a ratio known to ancient Greek astronomers who mapped celestial music through motion. Pythagoras called it the music of the spheres, the invisible song produced when the heavens turned in perfect proportion. To the Hospitallers, this harmony became sacred code. Their cross, divided into 8, mirrored not only their virtues, but also the octaves of cosmic frequency. The vault beneath Rhodes, designed in the shape of overlapping crosses and stars, was an instrument, a resonant chamber tuned to the Earth's own rhythm. When light, sound, or even the movement of the tide entered at precise intervals, it would hum faintly, like a bell struck by time itself. Byzantine scholars of the 14th century described such places as templa photos, temples of light, where geometry met liturgy. The Hospitallers adapted the idea into their secret order of cipher-keepers, the Custodes Silentii, or guardians of silence. These men, trained in astronomy, medicine, and architecture, guarded the hidden ratios connecting the order's strongholds from Jerusalem to Rhodes, from Rhodes to Malta. Their records spoke of a path of numbers that cannot be unlearned, the Via Numerorum. When the Ottomans besieged Rhodes in 1480, these same guardians sealed the underground sanctuary not to hide gold, but to preserve resonance. For they believed the vault's alignment, its proportions, its angles, its geometry, could focus divine light through sound. The code within was therefore not to be read, but one to be heard. Centuries later, fragments of the same proportions surfaced in unexpected places, in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, in the floor plans of Maltese chapels, even in the navigational charts of early Renaissance sailors who marked their routes by ratios rather than stars. A secret geometry seemed to hum across cultures, Greek, Byzantine, Latin, and Islamic, each preserving a fragment of the whole. It is now understood that Arabic mathematicians, working in Damascus and Baghdad, passed their algebraic symmetries to Crusader scholars during brief truces and exchanges of prisoners. The Hospitallers learned from these encounters not only the science of healing, but the logic of balance,
the idea that number itself was divine. And in the alchemical texts smuggled westward, one phrase recurs: "That which is hidden is not lost, it vibrates." In her final notes, Eleni wrote that the Hospitaller cipher was a symphony of proportion, a code that links stone to starlight. She speculated that the rhythmic pulse detected beneath Rhodes in Malta was a residual resonance, the echo of an architectural equation so precise that it continues to hum through time. Some scientists dismiss the idea as coincidence, a trick of magnetism or geology. Yet others, quietly studying the vault's harmonic ratios, whisper that the pattern is intentional, that the Hospitallers succeeded in creating a structure that perpetually sings to the cosmos. If that is true, then the Rhodes Riddle is not merely an enigma of treasure or faith, but the oldest surviving hymn of mathematics, a geometry written to outlive empires. And so, as the night falls over the ancient seas once more, the rhythm endures, a silent chord struck between heaven and earth, between the past and what still waits to be understood.
In every era, there are men and women who inherit what others forget. After the fall of Rhodes and later the rise of Malta, the Hospitaller's public face became charitable and martial. Knights turned administrators, healers, and diplomats. But beneath the surface of ceremony, a smaller current flowed unseen, a lineage of cipher keepers whose duty was no longer to defend walls, but to guard a pattern. They called themselves Custodes Silentii, guardians of silence. Their symbol was not the sword or cross, but a small compass set within an eightfold star. The seal appeared only on private correspondence, carved faintly into the margins of papal dispensations and architectural blueprints. To the outside world, these were architects, physicians, astronomers, the quiet scholars who designed the geometry of Europe's cathedrals and hospitals. But their hidden vocation was to preserve the sacred ratio, aurea temperantia, the golden balance that united the divine and the human. Records from the 16th century mention a secret circle of Maltese Hospitallers exchanging letters with scholars in Florence and Venice. Among their correspondents was Leon Battista Alberti, the Renaissance theorist who wrote of hidden mathematical harmonies in sacred buildings. In one marginal note of his treatise De Re Aedificatoria, there appears a small, almost invisible 8-pointed cross drawn inside a circle, a sign identical to that found in the Hospitaller crypt of Valletta. It was not a decoration, but an acknowledgement. Through these exchanges, fragments of Hospitaller geometry entered the notebooks of later masters, Leonardo da Vinci, Francesco di Giorgio, and even the architects of St. Peter's Basilica. Each drew upon a silent inheritance, proportion as theology, mathematics as prayer. The eightfold symmetry of the Hospitaller cross appeared transfigured in the rose windows of Gothic churches and the floor mosaics of Renaissance chapels, where visitors still walk across invisible ciphers without knowing they stand within a coded hymn. As the centuries passed, the Custodes Silentii adapted to the changing world. During the Enlightenment, when science sought to separate itself from faith, the guardians concealed their legacy beneath the language of philosophy and art. In the private academies of Paris and London, they gathered under the guise of mathematical societies and architectural lodges, studying ratios that mirrored the old monastic diagrams. Their manuscripts spoke not of saints, but of symmetry, the continuation of the same geometry now described in secular terms. Yet their correspondence retained a single phrase at the close of every letter: In silentio lumen manet. In silence, the light remains. It is in this period that we find the first mention of the Order of Harmonic Architects, a small fraternity in Florence, whose emblem, the cross within a crescent,
mirrors the sigil found on the Elimion gold bars centuries earlier. Their archives, preserved today in the Biblioteca Nazionale, contain sketches of Malta's co-cathedral floor plan, annotated with cryptic comments linking the building's dimensions to the orbital ratios of Venus and the Moon. They believed, as the Hospitallers once did, that harmony was divine speech, a conversation between heaven and stone. In the 18th century, the Custodes Silencii vanished from formal record. Some historians argue they merged with the early Rosicrucian movements, carrying their geometric symbolism into the metaphors of light and rebirth. Others see their influence in the early Freemasons, whose compasses and squares echo the same devotion to sacred proportion. Yet direct evidence remains elusive, scattered in marginalia and architectural anomalies. Eightfold stars carved into keystones, invisible symmetries binding altars to skylights, cathedrals tuned to equinox light. A parchment discovered in the 1790s within the archives of the Order of St. John in Valletta refers cryptically to the heirs of geometry who preserve the voice of stone. The writer, believed to be a Maltese prior named Giacomo del Monte, claims that one of the original cipher keepers escaped to southern France during the Napoleonic invasion, carrying a map of light drawn in ratio and shadow. There, among ruined monasteries and silent abbeys, the tradition is said to have survived in private study circles well into the 19th century. By then, the world had changed. Empires rose on industry, not sanctity. The old geometry seemed forgotten, but even as railroads and telegraphs cut across Europe, a quiet echo endured. Architects designing observatories and universities unconsciously repeated the same proportions that had once defined the Hospitaller vaults. The alignment of Rhodes and Malta, that pulse of 8, appeared again in the blueprints of domes, clock towers, and bridges. It was as if the pattern had entered the collective memory of civilization itself, a rhythm woven so deeply into human design that it could no longer be separated from it. In the present day, a few scholars trace the lineage forward, through Rosicrucian diagrams, through Masonic tracing boards, through the harmonic grids of modern city planning, always finding the same ghostly resonance of eightfold symmetry. No secret society claims ownership now. Perhaps the Custodes Silencii no longer exist as a brotherhood, but as an idea, diffused, anonymous, still guarding the old geometry by living it, by building it into the world around us. Eleni Papadakis, in her final essay before her disappearance, wrote, "Every era recreates the riddle anew. The language of the knights was never lost. It became the architecture of the human mind. We all walk inside its vault. The world no longer calls them hospitallers, or guardians, or cipher keepers, but in the rhythm of cathedrals, in the quiet balance of bridges, in the symmetry of light through glass, the same design endures, calm, patient, waiting for recognition. And in that enduring silence, the ancient vow remains unbroken. The geometry of faith, humming softly beneath the noise of history."
The world turned toward reason, but reason still looked to the stars. By the dawn of the 16th century, the great empires of Europe had begun their voyages into the unknown, carrying with them not relics of saints, but compasses, astrolabes, and charts drawn with mathematical precision. Yet, in the quiet lineage of those who measured and mapped, the faint fingerprints of the Hospitallers still remained. In the maritime academies of Venice and Lisbon, certain geometric symbols appeared on navigational manuscripts, a circle quartered by diagonal lines, its center marked with a cross of 8 points. To the sailors and scholars who studied these drawings, it was simply an emblem of accuracy. But to those who knew the old language of the Custodes Silencii, it was a fragment of the ancient code, reinterpreted in the geometry of the compass rose. The Hospitallers had once been the guardians of routes.
from the pilgrim roads of the Holy Land to the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. They understood the world as a web of balance, every journey a reflection of celestial order. That same principle guided the cartographers who followed, Andrea Bianco, Fra Mauro, and later Mercator. Each of them worked within proportional systems that bore traces of the old sacred geometry. Even when they claimed to reject mysticism, their maps echoed the same rhythm, the earth measured by the breath of the divine. The mathematicians of the new era believed they were discovering laws that belonged only to nature, yet many of their diagrams resembled those once carved into the vaults beneath the grand palace of Rhodes. Circles nested in squares, triangles inscribed within stars, the language of proportion made universal. What had once been a cipher of faith had become the grammar of science. When Nicholas Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbius Celestium in 1543, few noticed that the opening diagrams of planetary motion followed the same eightfold harmonic division used by medieval builders to align chapels and towers. The correspondence was no accident. Copernicus had studied in Bologna, where remnants of the Hospitaller libraries still survived. He inherited their obsession with symmetry, their reverence for the circle, the silent theology that equated motion with creation. The same geometry passed, quietly, into the hands of Galileo Galilei. In his notebooks preserved in Florence, sketches of pendulums and lenses are bordered by small decorative crosses of 8 points. Doodles, perhaps, or perhaps a subconscious echo of the old code. The Hospitallers had always believed that light was the purest expression of divine order, and Galileo, watching the moons of Jupiter, found that same order written in orbits and shadows. He saw what the knights had once sensed, that truth could be measured and yet remain sacred. By the 17th century, as telescopes turned outward and compasses inward, the Hospitaller influence had diffused into the very instruments of exploration. The astrolabe, long favored by mariners, was itself a relic of that shared language between East and West, refined in Arabic workshops and polished by Christian hands. Its structure, based on concentric circles and radial lines, mirrored the Pythagorean and Hospitaller notion that the universe was a harmony of ratios. Each reading of latitude and declination was, in a sense, a prayer in numbers. The ships of Portugal and Spain carried those instruments into the Atlantic. The same geometric precision that had once guided crusader fleets to the Levant now guided explorers toward the Americas and beyond. The knights had sought Jerusalem. Their intellectual descendants sought the edges of the world. And though the names had changed, order, academy, Royal Society, the quiet discipline of observation, proportion, and code remained the same. In Malta, where the Hospitallers built their new stronghold after Rhodes, the connection between faith and measurement deepened further. The observatory at St. Elmo was aligned with mathematical accuracy to the solstices, and its foundations carried inscriptions that some believed to be remnants of the Rhodesian cipher. Within its stone geometry, sunlight on certain days of the year struck exact points upon the walls, forming fleeting shapes of stars and crosses that appeared, glowed, and faded with the turning earth, a reminder that time itself was part of the riddle. When the Age of Enlightenment dawned, men like Isaac Newton began to see numbers as the purest reflection of God's mind. His Principia Mathematica drew upon laws that mirrored those carved into the Hospitaller vaults centuries before. The belief that order was eternal and that every motion of matter followed divine geometry. Newton, who studied theology in secret and alchemy in solitude, spoke of light in ways that would have resonated with the Knights of Rhodes. He wrote, "God is known from his works," words that might have been whispered by a Hospitaller monk measuring the shadows of his chapel at noon. By the 1700s, the ancient link between number and faith had almost dissolved from memory. Yet the architecture of reason still bore its imprint. The observatories at Greenwich and Paris, the great Baroque churches of Rome, and the bridges of Venice all carried the same quiet rhythm of proportion, that subtle eightfold harmony underlying every curve and pillar. The Hospitaller's riddle had evolved. No longer a secret to guard, it had become a philosophy to live by, an unseen code woven into the instruments and institutions of human progress. In laboratories and map rooms, in cathedrals and academies, the same geometry pulsed under the surface, unchanged though unacknowledged. Modern historians often describe the Enlightenment as a rebellion against the Church, but perhaps it was also its continuation, the mind of the medieval order unfolding into light. The Hospitallers had once believed that to understand geometry was to glimpse the face of God. The scientists who followed them searched for the same face in the laws of gravity, optics, and motion. Each calculation was a quiet hymn, precise, disciplined, serene. In this slow transformation, the Rhodesian riddle ceased to be the possession of a few. It became the inheritance of humanity itself. Every navigator tracing the curvature of the earth, every mathematician drawing the arc of a parabola, every architect balancing light and shadow, all were unknowingly walking the path of the night's lost code. And though the world forgot their names, the Hospitaller's secret survived in the only place it ever truly lived, within the harmony between measure and mystery.
Time moves quietly upon the stones of Rhodes. By the 19th century, the once mighty bastions of the Hospitallers stood as romantic ruins, softened by ivy and sea wind. Europe had entered an age of discovery once more, not of oceans, but of the past. Archaeology had become a new kind of crusade, men armed not with swords, but with spades and lanterns, seeking to unearth the faith of centuries gone. When British travelers first arrived on the island after the fall of Napoleon, they found the remnants of the medieval order half buried beneath Ottoman dust. The great street of the Knights lay silent, its stones cracked, but still aligned with a precision that defied decay. Each window, each arch, each angle seemed measured by an intelligence that spoke across time, as though the architects had known that geometry could outlast empire. The scholars who measured those ruins were the new kind of pilgrims. Charles Newton, British archaeologist and diplomat, noted in his journals that the fortress of Rhodes possessed a symmetry not of fortification alone, but of theology, a harmony visible in stone. He described strange carvings found in the lower vaults of the Grand Palace, 8-pointed stars, serpentine lines, and what appeared to be coded inscriptions in Latin and Greek letters arranged in mathematical order. He could not decipher them. He wrote only, "The stone remembers." Throughout the 19th century, the ruins of Rhodes became a theater of quiet fascination. Artists painted its gates beneath moonlight. Poets described it as a sleeping citadel of angels. Yet, among the local inhabitants, older whispers endured, tales of buried chambers beneath the palace, of tunnels that led to the sea, and of bells that rang where no church stood. Fishermen spoke of the barren island of Alumia, where at night the air shimmered faintly and the waves seemed to echo metallic tones. The island's silence was broken only by wind and superstition. By the dawn of the 20th century, these stories had drawn the attention of a new kind of explorer, one driven not by piety, but by ideology. As Europe turned to war, ancient symbols gained new meaning. Secret societies, occult philosophers, and political mystics all searched for lost wisdom buried in the ruins of Christendom. The Hospitallers' geometry, once a quiet science of proportion, became a cipher for power. When the Axis occupied the Dodecanese in 1943, a special detachment of the German Ehrenerbe arrived on Rhodes under orders from Berlin. Officially,
they were to conduct architectural surveys. Unofficially, they sought evidence of Aryan geometric influence, a phrase that cloaked their true interest in the Hospitaller vaults. The leader of the mission, Dr. Wilhelm von Knecht, was a historian of medieval orders and an admirer of Otto Rahn, the mystic who had pursued the Grail in the Pyrenees. Von Knecht believed the Knights of St. John had inherited a secret solar code linking the East and West through geometry, a divine formula that could, as he claimed, awaken the hidden strength of civilization. On the night of April 17, 1944, his team descended beneath the Grand Palace. Their report, later declassified by Allied intelligence, describes a chamber discovered 20 meters below the surface, sealed by fused volcanic stone. When opened, it revealed walls carved with intricate star patterns resembling both Arabic and Pythagorean diagrams. At the chamber's center stood a pedestal of black basalt, and upon it fragments of what appeared to be an obsidian cube. The fragments bore golden traces forming faint grid lines, a pattern identical to the Hospitaller grid described in lost Maltese manuscripts of the 16th century. The Germans photographed the find, but within weeks Allied bombings forced their withdrawal. When British forces later entered Rhodes, the chamber was sealed again, this time deliberately. The surviving reports vanished into military archives, filed under Restricted Historical Anomalies Mediterranean Theater. Decades later, an Italian diver named Marco Valenti would claim to have seen the same basalt pedestal while exploring a flooded tunnel near the Mandrake harbor. He described a black altar beneath the water, shaped by human hands, inscribed with stars. His notes preserved in a private collection include sketches of 8 radiating lines converging at a single point, the ancient mark of the Hospitaller's chiffer. Valenti drowned the following year during an unrelated expedition off Crete. His body was never recovered. Yet even stripped of mystery, the pattern persisted. Modern archaeologists examining Rhodes with ground-penetrating radar have detected geometric voids beneath the old fortress, symmetrical spaces that do not correspond to known architecture. To engineers, they are anomalies. To historians of the order, they are echoes, remnants of an age when architecture itself was scripture. Meanwhile, the island of Alamir remains uninhabited. Only seabirds and goats wander its dry slopes. From the air, its outline resembles an hourglass, 2 crescents joined by a narrow isthmus, shaped uncannily like the symbol found on the alleged gold bars described in Otto Rahn's diary, the crescent and cross intertwined. The ruins of a Byzantine chapel still stand on its highest ridge. During certain nights of the year, the moonlight falls through its broken apse to strike a single slab of stone engraved with concentric circles. To most who see it, it is nothing more than erosion. But to those who remember the legend, it is a reminder that geometry, once consecrated, never entirely dies. When the war ended, the archives of both victors and vanquished preserved fragments of these investigations. Reports of knightly design beneath Rhodes appeared briefly in post-war intelligence summaries, then faded from view. But the whispers endured, among scholars, among sailors, among those who felt that history had left unfinished business beneath the stones. The riddle had reawakened, not as faith nor as greed, but as curiosity. The modern mind armed with science had rediscovered the same wonder that once drove monks to carve numbers into cathedrals. Every radar scan, every sonar sweep of the Aegean floor was another echo of the old vow: to seek order beneath chaos, light beneath silence. In the quiet rhythm of waves against the citadel walls, the island still hums with memory, not as myth, nor as proof, but as presence. A silence that outlasts all languages. A geometry still unfolding in shadow and sea.
History rarely ends. It only changes its instruments. In the twilight after the Second World War, the ruins of Rhodes were silent once more, but the world beyond them trembled with new forms of power, invisible, mathematical, and absolute. Nations now built empires not on stone, but on information. And in that new realm of numbers, the old code stirred again. In the early 1950s, a small division within the British Admiralty began cataloging historical fortifications across the Mediterranean. The goal was simple: to study how medieval geometry could inform modern defense design. But among the files marked Rhodes, one report stood apart: a collection of wartime photographs recovered from German archives showing the basalt chamber beneath the Grand Palace. The images revealed patterns of eightfold symmetry etched into the walls, resembling binary grids when overlaid with tracing paper. A mathematician assigned to the project noted, almost idly, "The sequence resembles coordinate encoding, possibly symbolic, possibly numeric." That observation found its way into the notebooks of an analyst named Thomas Hargreaves, who later joined Britain's fledgling Signals Intelligence Service. In his private correspondence, preserved decades later, he wrote, "These hospitaller diagrams predate Boolean logic but mimic its structure: dualities, crossings, and reversals. Perhaps not language, but an anticipation of it." To Hargreaves, the carvings beneath Rhodes were not mystical, they were systematic. The riddle, he proposed, might be the earliest visual model of what the 20th century would rediscover as binary code: light and shadow, on and off, 1 and 0. No proof existed, but the theory circulated quietly among mathematicians in London and Cambridge, where the new machines of computation were being born. By the 1960s, during the height of the Cold War, the Rhodes Vault resurfaced in a different context. Satellite imagery and deep penetration radar from American reconnaissance missions over the Aegean revealed substructures beneath the old palace that had never been mapped. One analyst from the U.S. Navy Cryptologic Group reviewing the data remarked that the alignment of the tunnels mirrored signal modulation patterns. It was coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps the geometry of faith had simply become the geometry of communication. Meanwhile, across Europe, archaeologists returned to the island, their work funded quietly by cultural ministries and, less openly, by intelligence agencies seeking artifacts of symbolic prestige. The excavation of 1967, led by the Greek archaeologist Sophia Konturi, uncovered fragments of tile bearing numeric inscriptions, now stored in the Archaeological Museum of Rhodes. Each tile carried paired symbols, a Maltese cross flanked by two opposing crescents, and a sequence of dots and dashes arranged in a grid. When the markings were digitally analyzed decades later, they corresponded to simple binary values, ones and zeros. The pattern, when translated into modern ASCII code, formed the letter phi, the Greek symbol for the golden ratio. Scholars dismissed it as coincidence, yet the coincidence itself became part of the island's mythology. Journalists began to speak of the hospitaller algorithm, a poetic term for the idea that the Knights of Rhodes had intuited a code that mirrored nature's mathematics, harmony, balance, recursion. It was not that they had invented computers, but that they had understood the eternal rhythm computers would later obey. During the 1970s, Cold War paranoia deepened. The Soviet Union, aware of Western research in symbolic cryptography, dispatched its own cultural attachés to the Dodekanis under the guise of archaeological support. Among their reports, now declassified, is a curious note from 1978 describing a basalt structure beneath Alemia emitting faint magnetic interference. No such anomaly was ever confirmed, but the rumor spread through military circles that something metallic, perhaps technological, lay buried beneath the Isle of Silence. For a brief moment, Rhodes became a point of intersection between archaeology and espionage. British and American operatives posing as restoration teams monitored each other's digs, while local workers told stories of foreign men who carried compasses that did not point north and who mapped the ruins by moonlight. To the islanders, it was nothing new.
The old fortress had always drawn those who sought secrets beneath its stones. When the Cold War finally waned, the obsession turned inward once more. In 1991, a group of mathematicians and historians from the University of Patras began cataloging medieval geometric manuscripts in digital form. Among the scanned documents were copies of Hospitaller architectural plans preserved in the Vatican archives. A student named Eleni Papadakis, the same scholar who would later disappear, noticed that when the plans of Rhodes, Malta, and Jerusalem were overlaid digitally, their main axes intersected at precise angular ratios identical to those found in modern encryption grids, as if the old fortresses had been designed as parts of one great cipher, a map whose key was mathematics itself. Her research, published quietly in 1995, proposed that the Hospitallers had used geometry as both code and creed, a dual language that could express theology and technology at once. She wrote, "The fortress is the text, the ratios are the syntax. The divine name is written not in letters, but in proportion." Within months, her paper was withdrawn under academic pressure. The digital files vanished from the university's servers, leaving only fragments mirrored on private disks. Her colleagues said she left Greece for Italy. No one saw her again. Yet her ideas lingered. In an era obsessed with encryption, from Cold War satellites to the newborn internet, the notion that medieval knights had hidden a proto-digital system in stone captured imaginations across the world. Filmmakers, novelists, and programmers began to speak of the Rhodes Protocol, a metaphor for the continuity between faith and computation, between the sacred and the coded, a myth reborn in binary light. By the early 2000s, digital archaeologists using 3D mapping of Rhodes rediscovered the same symmetrical voids once detected by radar in the 1940s. Their models revealed a network of substructures running like veins beneath the old city, perfect in ratio, harmonic in angle. When illuminated through simulation, the paths of those corridors formed an unmistakable pattern, the eight-pointed cross of St. John, glowing softly in virtual light. It was the same design that had guided sailors, architects, and monks for 8 centuries, now rendered not in stone or parchment, but in pixels. The riddle had crossed its final threshold. The geometry of faith had become the architecture of data. And beneath the noise of modern networks, some claimed to hear an ancient silence still humming, the same measured breath that once guided compasses toward Jerusalem. The Hospitallers were gone, their order secularized into charity and diplomacy. Yet the emblem remained, 8 points, infinite symmetry, a symbol of balance and of something waiting quietly at the heart of all systems, from the orbit of planets to the flicker of machines. And in the tranquil hum of a server room, where light pulses in rhythm like a heartbeat, the riddle endures, not as a mystery, not as a proof, but as the still geometry between thought and silence.
The 21st century began with noise. Satellites orbiting in unbroken chains, cities glowing across the night like constellations of their own making. Yet beneath that brilliance, silence endured. In the gaps between signals and code, a familiar rhythm waited. The same pattern the Hospitallers once carved into the foundations of Rhodes, now pulsing invisibly through circuits and servers. When modern archaeologists returned to the island in the 2010s, they did not bring shovels or chisels. They arrived with LiDAR scanners, magnetometers, and AI-driven algorithms capable of peeling away centuries of dust layer by layer. Each measurement revealed more than ruins. It revealed relationships, angles matching the slope of sunrise on the equinox, vaults aligned to distant isles as though tracing a celestial grid. The island itself seemed designed to converse with light. Under the Grand Palace, the radar arrays found what earlier explorers could only guess: a symmetrical network of voids forming the geometry of an 8-pointed cross, extending beneath the Street of the Knights and toward the sea. But within those shapes were subtler harmonies. Triangles nested within circles, their ratios reflecting the golden mean, phi, repeating like a pulse through the stone. It was as though the island had been constructed as a vast harmonic instrument, tuned to the mathematics of creation. A team from the University of Patras, working with digital archivists in Rome, began feeding the measurements into a neural network designed for architectural reconstruction. When the system analyzed the spatial data, it generated a 3D model of the fortress. But what appeared next surprised everyone. Hidden within the geometry of the walls, invisible to human eyes, was a second, ghostly structure. Lines and planes that, when connected, formed a grid identical to the pattern of the hospitaller cube of Alimia, described in 16th century manuscripts. The AI had rediscovered what the monks once encoded by hand. When the model was rotated under virtual moonlight, faint reflections aligned perfectly with the positions of the Dodecanese islands on the summer solstice. The system marked each coordinate with luminous dots. 7 points matched known isles: Rhodes, Halki, Tylos, Simi, Nisiros, Kos, and Kalymnos, but one remained blank, a coordinate without an island, a missing piece. The AI labeled it automatically Delta. Delta. In Greek, the 4th letter of the alphabet, but also the symbol for change. Scholars argued endlessly over its meaning. Some said it was a coincidence, others claimed it was evidence of intentional design. But to those who studied the Hospitaler's code, the answer was simple. The missing island was not meant to be found. It was meant to represent silence itself, the unspoken element that completes harmony, a space for the divine between notes.
Under the Grand Palace, the radar arrays found what earlier explorers could only guess: a symmetrical network of voids forming the geometry of an 8-pointed cross, extending beneath the Street of the Knights and toward the sea. But within those shapes were subtler harmonies: triangles nested within circles, their ratios reflecting the golden mean, phi, repeating like a pulse through the stone. It was as though the island had been constructed as a vast harmonic instrument tuned to the mathematics of creation. A team from the University of Patras, working with digital archivists in Rome, began feeding the measurements into a neural network designed for architectural reconstruction. When the system analyzed the spatial data, it generated a 3D model of the fortress. But what appeared next surprised everyone. Hidden within the geometry of the walls, invisible to human eyes, was a second, ghostly structure. Lines and planes that, when connected, formed a grid identical to the pattern of the hospitaller cube of Alimia, described in 16th century manuscripts. The AI had rediscovered what the monks once encoded by hand. When the model was rotated under virtual moonlight, faint reflections aligned perfectly with the positions of the Dodecanese islands on the summer solstice. The system marked each coordinate with luminous dots. 7 points matched known isles: Rhodes, Halki, Tylos, Simi, Nisiros, Kos, and Kalymnos, but one remained blank, a coordinate without an island, a missing piece. The AI labeled it automatically Delta. Delta. In Greek, the 4th letter of the alphabet, but also the symbol for change. Scholars argued endlessly over its meaning.
Some said it was coincidence. Others claimed it was evidence of intentional design. But to those who studied the Hospitaler's code, the answer was simple. The missing island was not meant to be found. It was meant to represent silence itself, the unspoken element that completes harmony, a space for the divine between notes. As news of the discovery spread, artists and scientists alike began to revisit the Rhodes Riddle through new lenses. Physicists studying quantum geometry saw parallels between the night's proportions and modern theories of space-time curvature. Neuroscientists exploring the geometry of perception noticed that the human brain organizes spatial awareness in ratios close to phi, the same ratio that defines the Hospitaler's star. Some began to speak of the riddle not as a code to be broken, but as a map of consciousness itself, a bridge between matter and meaning. In one of her last verified notes before vanishing, Eleni Papadakis had written, "If the riddle exists, it is not buried beneath Rhodes, it is the architecture of thought. The cube, the cross, the grid, they are reflections of how the mind orders the infinite." Decades later, her words would become prophetic. In 2024, an AI-assisted linguistic project at the University of Vienna analyzed the surviving Hospitaler manuscripts using pattern recognition algorithms. It found that the distribution of letters and symbols within the texts followed mathematical sequences nearly identical to those used in modern encryption, and more astonishingly, to the neural pathways of visual cognition. The Hospitalers had somehow intuited the geometry of human understanding centuries before it was mapped by neuroscience. The project's final report ended with a single line: "We are beginning to read what they once prayed." Across Rhodes, restoration teams have since begun to treat the island not merely as a historical site, but as a resonant organism, a structure designed to channel light, ratio, and sound. Acoustic engineers discovered that in certain chapels, a whisper beneath the central dome echoes precisely 8 times before fading, a natural resonance matching the 8 points of the Hospitaler cross. The architecture itself seems to breathe in harmonic rhythm, as though the stones remember the chants of their builders. In the silence of the Aegean night, where wind hums against marble and sea reflects starlight, the old fortress glows faintly under the moon. Tourists walk its corridors unaware that beneath their feet lies a map not of treasure, but of perception, a design linking the pulse of human thought with the geometry of the cosmos. For the first time in centuries, the riddle is no longer guarded, hidden, or forbidden. It has become something gentler, a meditation on connection between faith and mathematics, between the builders and the discoverers, between the stones of Rhodes and the digital light of our age. Modern scholars call it the continuity of silence, the idea that wisdom survives not in what is spoken, but in what endures unspoken. The Hospitalers carved it in stone. The scientists encoded in data. Both, in their own way, reach toward the same eternal symmetry. And so the geometry lives on, not only beneath the island, but in every structure that seeks harmony between light and shadow, chaos and order, reason and awe. It is the same balance that guides the stars above the Aegean and the neurons firing within the human mind. What began as a fortress has become a reflection, a mirror of the divine pattern that shapes all things. The Rhodes Riddle was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be remembered, as silence remembering itself through the language of form.
The dawn rises softly over the Aegean. The light moves slowly across the sea, sliding over the ruins of Rhodes, touching the domes and battlements that have stood through centuries of empire and silence. Every stone carries a memory,
Every shadow contains the geometry of something larger than time. The Hospitallers are long gone from their fortress, but the pattern they left, the deliberate harmony between angle and arc, continues to speak through the centuries. Architects who study the Grand Palace still remark on its quiet perfection, the symmetry of doorways, the alignment of courtyards, the measured curve of staircases that always lead to light. Each proportion, each ratio, seems chosen not merely for function, but for contemplation. A prayer in geometry. In the monasteries of Mount Athos, fragments of old Hospitaller manuscripts survive, copied, translated, softened through centuries of devotion. One small passage, written in Greek and Latin side by side, reads, "The measure of the temple is the measure of man, and the measure of man is the measure of heaven." Scholars once dismissed such lines as mystical ornamentation. Now, in light of modern discoveries, they are seen as evidence of the Order's deeper pursuit, not conquest, but coherence. To the Hospitallers, the island of Rhodes was more than a fortress. It was an experiment in sacred architecture. Each chamber, each wall was aligned to stars and tides, forming a vast calendar of light. Art historians have traced the same pattern outward into cathedrals and hospitals across the Mediterranean. The proportions of windows, the rhythm of arches, even the spacing of cloisters mirror the same harmonic ratios first recorded in Rhodes. It is as if the Hospitallers carried their secret geometry wherever they went, embedding it into every act of creation, a quiet signature of unity between human and divine. Painters of the late Renaissance, especially those in Venice and Malta, inherited fragments of that language. In the works of Caravaggio, who painted for the Knights of Malta, light falls with surgical precision, illuminating the same octagonal symmetry hidden in the Order's cross. To those who know, his chiaroscuro is not just drama, it is code, a revelation of proportion disguised as emotion. Later, in the Enlightenment, when reason sought to banish mystery, architects still returned to the ratios of Rhodes. The Hospitaller cross, once a symbol of faith, became a diagram of equilibrium, 8 points reflecting balance, structure, and infinite recursion. Mathematicians studying the golden mean used its outline to explain beauty, proportion, and the harmony of systems. Thus the riddle endured, no longer whispered among monks, but woven into the foundations of science and art alike. In the quiet galleries of the Malta Museum of Archaeology, one can still find the obsidian cube recovered from Alimia. Dark, smooth, and unyielding, it sits behind glass, yet it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. Visitors rarely linger, sensing that the object carries something beyond explanation. But when moonlight falls through the skylight and strikes its surface, faint golden lines emerge, a network of arcs and intersections that pulse like veins under skin. No one today has deciphered them completely. Perhaps they are not meant to be deciphered. Perhaps their purpose is to remind humanity that knowledge, when pure, does not end in certainty, but in wonder. In recent years, philosophers have spoken of the Hospitaller paradox, the idea that an order born from warfare and service could also become the keeper of one of history's most elegant geometries of peace. The paradox lies in their duality: warriors who healed, ascetics who commanded fleets, scientists who prayed. In their architecture, that duality becomes harmony. The angles of defense transform into the curves of sanctuary. Even their cross, sharp and symmetrical, is a symbol of balance between tension and release, between the sword and the chalice. There is a stillness in Rhodes now. The island sleeps under olive trees and golden light, its past folded like parchment beneath the soil. Yet every summer solstice, when the sun rises directly along the street of the knights, its rays strike the central arch of the grand palace with unerring precision. For a few moments, the stone glows as if lit from within, a silent reenactment of the island's ancient alignment to the heavens. Tourists take photographs, unaware that they are capturing a celestial equation inscribed centuries ago by hands guided by faith and geometry alike. In this way, the riddle continues to reveal itself, not as a single answer, but as a continuum of revelation. Every era deciphers a different layer. The medieval monks saw it as divine order. The Renaissance saw beauty. The modern age sees mathematics. Each interpretation reflects the same symmetry through a different mirror. In a small chapel near Lindos, a faded fresco remains, a knight kneeling before a sphere of light. Behind him, the sea stretches endless and blue. No name, no inscription, only the faint trace of a compass rose beneath his hands. Art historians call it the geometer's prayer. It is said that the painter was one of the last hospitallers to remain after the Ottoman conquest, working in secret until his death. He left no gold, no relics, only this image of devotion, where faith and mathematics converge into a single serene act of creation. As the centuries pass, the riddle transforms from mystery to metaphor, a symbol of humanity's eternal attempt to measure the infinite, to give form to awe. Perhaps that is what the Hospitallers understood at last, that treasure, once sought in gold, was always hidden in the structure of light, and that the island they built was not just a fortress against the world, but a mirror of the cosmos within it. The geometry endures. In the quiet rhythm of waves, in the spiral of a shell, in the lattice of stars reflected on the sea at night. Rhodes remains what it has always been, a meeting place between the visible and the unseen. The riddle was never about solving, it was about seeing.
Night returns to Rhodes as it always has, quietly, without hurry. The last warmth of the sun withdraws from the stones of the old fortress, and the sea begins to mirror the sky. The air carries a faint taste of salt and jasmine. In the courtyards of the grand palace, where torches once burned for the Hospitallers, only the whisper of the wind remains, threading through arches and carved emblems of the cross. The island settles into stillness. The day's travelers have gone. Their footsteps fade down the narrow cobblestone streets, leaving only the hush of the waves. In this hour, the fortress seems alive again, not with men, but with memory. Light glimmers across the marble floors like water moving through glass, and the shadow of the ancient walls lengthens into forms that almost breathe. Somewhere beneath those stones, the unseen chambers wait, the geometric vaults where code and faith once met. If one could listen closely, perhaps even now there might be an echo, the faint tapping of chisels, the rhythm of prayers spoken in Latin, the murmur of the sea striking against the island's edge like a heartbeat marking eternity. There is no treasure here, no gold, no jeweled relics, only proportion, only silence, only the design itself, the unbroken symmetry of meaning that stretches from the builder's hands to the stars above the Aegean.
On clear nights, the constellation of Orion rises above the horizon, its belt aligning perfectly with the old harbor and the eastern gate of the city. It is the same alignment the Hospitallers once marked in their charts, tracing celestial order to guide both their ships and their souls. Above and below, heaven and earth mirror one another in perfect stillness. The sea reflects the stars, the stones reflect the past, and within that reflection lies the unspoken answer to the Rhodes Riddle. It was never about possession, not of land, not of gold, not even of knowledge. It was about the quiet pursuit of harmony, the search for a pattern that could reconcile all opposites. The Hospitallers, in their hidden sanctuaries, carved that pursuit into stone. Centuries later, the scientists who mapped their geometry rediscovered the same truth through data and light. Different languages, one design. The geometry endures because it was never confined to architecture or code. It lives in rhythm, the rhythm of thought, the rhythm of tide, the rhythm of human curiosity that refuses to fade. Each discovery is another chord in an endless composition, and Rhodes remains the echo chamber in which it continues to resonate.
Night returns to Rhodes as it always has, quietly, without hurry. The last warmth of the sun withdraws from the stones of the old fortress, and the sea begins to mirror the sky. The air carries a faint taste of salt and jasmine. In the courtyards of the Grand Palace, where torches once burned for the Hospitallers, only the whisper of the wind remains, threading through arches and carved emblems of the cross. The island settles into stillness. The day's travelers have gone. Their footsteps fade down the narrow cobblestone streets, leaving only the hush of the waves. In this hour, the fortress seems alive again, not with men, but with memory. Light glimmers across the marble floors like water moving through glass, and the shadow of the ancient walls lengthens into forms that almost breathe. Somewhere beneath those stones, the unseen chambers wait, the geometric vaults where code and faith once met. If one could listen closely, perhaps even now there might be an echo, the faint tapping of chisels, the rhythm of prayers spoken in Latin, the murmur of the sea striking against the island's edge like a heartbeat marking eternity. There is no treasure here, no gold, no jeweled relics, only proportion, only silence, only the design itself, the unbroken symmetry of meaning that stretches from the builder's hands to the stars above the Aegean. On clear nights, the constellation of Orion rises above the horizon, its belt aligning perfectly with the old harbor and the eastern gate of the city. It is the same alignment the Hospitallers once marked in their charts, tracing celestial order to guide both their ships and their souls. Above and below, heaven and earth mirror one another in perfect stillness. The sea reflects the stars, the stones reflect the past, and within that reflection lies the unspoken answer to the Rhodes Riddle. It was never about possession, not of land, not of gold, not even of knowledge. It was about the quiet pursuit of harmony, the search for a pattern that could reconcile all opposites. The Hospitallers, in their hidden sanctuaries, carved that pursuit into stone. Centuries later, the scientists who mapped their geometry rediscovered the same truth through data and light. Different languages, one design. The geometry endures because it was never confined to architecture or code. It lives in rhythm, the rhythm of thought, the rhythm of tide,
the rhythm of human curiosity that refuses to fade. Each discovery is another chord in an endless composition, and Rhodes remains the echo chamber in which it continues to resonate. Under the moon, the island glows like a relic. The walls gleam with a soft pallor. The sea hums below, patient and ancient. Somewhere a bell tolls, one note carried by the wind, slow and clear. It rings not for war or worship, but for remembrance, a reminder that silence itself can hold more truth than words. In the distance, on the uninhabited isle of Olimia, the waves break against volcanic stone. No light burns there, no voice calls across the water. Yet, to those who listen, there is a subtle rhythm, as if the sea were reciting an old language of proportion, a lullaby for what once was and what always will be. The Isle of Silence, the missing island in the cube's map, still stands unseen, its name justified by its nature. It holds the final coordinate of the riddle, the one not meant to be found, but to be felt. As midnight deepens, the Aegean turns black and gold. The sky folds into the sea until horizon and reflection become one. This is the geometry of peace, the moment where all separations dissolve. The Hospitallers are dust, their manuscripts faint with age, their stones worn smooth by centuries of salt and time. Yet the riddle breathes on. In the alignment of stars, in the quiet awe of those who stand among the ruins, in the symmetry that binds thought and cosmos. It endures because it speaks a language older than empire and younger than dawn. And so Rhodes sleeps. The fortress dreams of its builders, the builders dream of their code, and the code dreams of the divine order that inspired it. Faith becomes form, form becomes silence, silence becomes eternity. At last, the sea takes back the final sound, the whisper of the riddle itself, carried by the wind. What is hidden is not lost. What endures is not stone, but harmony. The waves answer with their endless rhythm. The island exhales, and the night closes gently, as if the world itself were falling into sleep.